Welcome everybody to today's session of the NENA Housing Week forum series. We've got Tim Riley here today, and we're going to have a pre-recorded session from Emma Spano, who can't join us in person unfortunately, and Linda Seaborn will also be joining us as soon as she gets out of her board meeting that's on at the moment. So today's session is all around finance options for housing alternatives. And I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I'm on, the Woiwurrung, Bunurong people, Wurundjeri country in Naarm in Melbourne. And as we always say, that it's a complex context to work in, talking about housing and ownership and land, in the context of unceded country, and as part of a methodology towards reconciliation and healing and care for country and improving relationality for all of us in this place. I think today, I'd also like to acknowledge the climate and biodiversity emergency as the other context in which we work. I think today's session we're going to start with Emma. Was that right, Tim?
Yeah, I think that would be good if we can start with Emma, for sure.
Excellent. So I'll just get you to bring it up and share screen.
Yeah, so Emma is an apology today, but we caught up yesterday and just recorded an interview. So I'll just share my screen and just play the interview. Everybody can see that?
Yep, that looks good.
Hi, Emma.
Hi, Tim. Nice to see you.
Likewise. So we've got Emma Spano, who's the head of impact lending at Bank Australia. And unfortunately, Emma couldn't join our live webinar. So we're doing a bit of a pre-record. So Emma's, well, Emma, firstly, maybe can you tell us a little bit about your personal background and maybe what's got you into this role in this time? Yeah.
Sure. Oh, thanks, Tim, and apologies, everyone. I couldn't be there live today. It was just, the world just didn't align for us. So this is the next best thing. So thanks, Tim, for taking the time to pre-record this with me. So as Tim said, I'm the head of impact lending at Bank Australia. I've been with the bank for just over 12 months. So I have a background in property finance, so having worked for some of the larger banks. But most recently, I actually spent 4 years working in the community housing sector. Housing has always been a massive passion of mine. And I think, having worked in the big bank land where you got, such, great experience, I've got a lot of my technical knowledge, but I really wanted to do something for purpose. And the community housing sector and working in that space really allowed me to do that. And then I got an opportunity to come and work at Bank Australia, a very purpose-driven business, and, a very big focus in the housing area as well. So getting to look at lots of different alternate models, continuing our work with the community housing sector as well.
Yep.
But yeah, we're really interested in co-creating. So
yeah,
there's a little bit of my background, Tim.
Yeah, no, great. So with respect to Bank Australia then, can you tell us a little bit more about, I suppose, Bank Australia as an organisation and what the impact lending business that you lead invests in?
Yeah, sure. So, Bank Australia is a customer-owned bank, and we want to be Australia's most trusted bank and a leading purpose-driven business. We, through the business of banking, we seek to be a force for good and really increase the positive impact that we have on people and planet. And one of the things that I think is really powerful in working for a member-owned bank is that we exist for the benefit of our customers and the community. So we are custodians of our customers' money. They also have really high expectations on us about how we use their deposits with us, and putting them at the centre of everything that we do. So I think there's like lots of alignment with NENA's work as well. Really wanting to contribute to a fair and just society. So impact lending at Bank Australia was the team I head up. A lot of people always ask me, well, what does that mean? So our impact lending is really our commercial lending or business lending in the bank. And one of the ways that we can signal impact and signal be the change we want to see in the world is using our products to invest into businesses, organisations, projects with positive social environmental impact. So in our impact lending area, we're doing this into 4 key areas. Most relevant for this discussion, I guess, is affordable and accessible housing is a big priority for us. Climate action, our target market at Bank Australia is socially aware Australians. Climate action is very big up there as a big priority, and that integrates in with our housing lending that we do as well, which is really important to note. Nature and biodiversity and First Nations economic empowerment and reconciliation. So they're our sort of priority areas. When we look at lending and impact, we're a bank and we, follow, prudent, responsible lending practices and credit assessment, but we also assess the impact of all the transactions we do in our team. So we have a responsible banking policy, and it basically informs all the lending that we do, and it sort of says who we lend to and who we don't lend to. So our negative streams are, we don't lend into fossil fuels or live animal exports, gambling, tobacco, but I think the responsible banking policy always also goes into more our positive screens, and it sort of dictates how we look at impact, and using the UN SDGs as well as a guide to make choices about which projects we support. I think
the UN SDGs being United Nations Sustainability
Development Goals. Yeah. And I think in our impact lending team, one of the things that we know is that we don't have all the answers or all the solutions, and partnerships and being part of like an ecosystem is really important to us. So we're a small bank and we have the ability to create with our partners, and in fact it's actually a priority of ours. So we ensure that we have our team that seeks to build knowledge, and we want to be part of the solution, and we recognise that to do that we need to invest in that and partner, and it's very important. So we see ourselves as because we're small, we can be agile and flexible, and we have a team that's really wanting to be part of the solutions, which is really quite powerful and really really exciting to be part of something like Bank Australia. So I hope that gives a bit of a background, Tim.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I suppose just from my perspective, I mean, in full disclosure, we've worked with you and Bank Australia on a couple of projects, and it does strike me. I mean, you talked about Bank Australia being small and nimble, and we have dealt with some of the sort of major banks and second-tier lenders over the time, and it does. I think one of the main positives that I see in the relationship we've developed with Bank Australia is your ability to be nimble, because a lot of the larger banks, I think just because of their size, they're quite siloed in how they look at different debt products, from land acquisition through to development finance to home loans, and because of just the way they're structured, different. They don't really have a holistic view necessarily of the whole transaction, and they're not necessarily looking at relationships over the long term. They might be looking for a you know, if it was development funding, then their focus is really just on that sort of narrow band of, you know, maybe 18 to 24 months when that funds might be there. They're not necessarily that worried about takeout or the land hold. But in essence, like if you have a debt fund or a debt partner that is looking at that holistically, there's a, you know, maybe a 34-year relationship there with customers, you know, and I do see that Bank Australia is looking at things a little more holistically than sort of,
the relationships are key to everything, right? And I think, I mean, that's something that I try and invoke in my team, is that we are a long-term partner, you know, not just, you know, with you, Tim, on some of the work we're doing with you, but others that you're working with, and how we connect, how we learn from each other, and being part of that overall system. So we're really focused on, you know, you mentioned that 18 to 20 month window of the development. Actually interested us what happens after that. You know, whether we're funding it or not, we want to make sure it's got great outcomes for people, it's environmentally sustainable, you know, what we're leaving the built environment contributes to community, and that is a very fundamental part of our assessment as well. So it's not just, you know, whether, you know, you can build the development, which, you know, that's important, but it's also about the outcomes and the longer term outcome. So I think, you know, some of my team, I think relationships are just completely key to everything. And I think that's one of the benefits of being able to work in a small team.
Yeah, for sure. So talking about projects then, and that sort of development phase specifically, well, and also I suppose backing it up to actual land acquisition. I mean, because you kind of can't do one without the other, you know, typically. You know, what are the critical aspects of a project that you want to understand before investing in, and how do you look at risk?
Yeah, sure. So I guess, so Bank Australia takes a pretty, you know, a prudent approach to risk, and there's a few reasons that we're a bank regulated by APRA, and you know, it is our responsibility to be prudent when we think about risk. But I think it goes more that we're a values-based bank and a responsible lender. So our risk is our customers' risk as well. And I think that, you know, I'm hoping in our interactions, we, you know, we share ideas and we think through things and we mitigate risk. But it's really, really important. The last thing we ever want to do is have to enforce or to, you know, that's where housing is critical to, so, you know, so many aspects of life, and it needs to be stable and secure. So, you know, we don't make apologies for being prudent or at risk, and that's a good thing. But I think that we can think about different risks because we prioritise the learning, the thinking, the working, the relationships with our customers. We can think about things, and we can think about things that are new to market because we can get comfortable with the risk that's associated with it, which sometimes is more difficult in the larger bank. Like you said, it can be quite siloed specific, but we have the space and the time to be able to think through it. So yes, we're prudent with risk, but at the same time, we are able to think about risk in a different way, potentially. So that's really important. I think when we're looking at, you know, development, capability is really, really important. So, and yes, you talked about land acquisition as well. And I suppose when we come into land, we sort of want to see that there is a project there. There's a project plan. There's something like, you know, we've worked on a couple together where, you know, they're not all the ducks lined up yet, but there's a plan on how you're going to get there, and what you're going to deliver at the end. I think so. The partnerships are really important. So who's involved in architecture, the building, the planning, all the critical pieces or ingredients that come into doing the development, and who you're partnering with to be able to deliver that. So that's from a capability perspective, but also from a financial capacity perspective. And are they connected with your vision as well? So I know, Tim, some of the partners that you work with are very aligned to what you're trying to achieve. And I think that's incredibly important because then people are with you when something maybe doesn't quite go right, or you have to think through something differently, and to make sure everybody's aligned. And that can be in terms of funding as well. So, you know, we're a bank and provide a strip of funding, but who else are the equity providers that might be in there, and what's their motivation? You know, it's okay to make a financial return, but it's also about, you know, the outcomes that we're delivering for social and environmental purposes. So partnership's really important. Governance is important. I think how decisions are made, who makes the decisions, you know, are they democratic, all those sorts of things as well, and the experience of those people making decisions. I think I sort of touched on Bank Australia's focused on climate and environmental sustainability, and we want to make sure that the buildings that we're investing in our built environment are here for the long term, and you know, are not resulting in tenant or resident poverty, energy poverty, or anything like that. So we're very big on the quality of the build as well, and I guess also, like, who is it for? Like, what's the market? Renting, purchasing, like what, like, are there going to be people available to live in these homes?
The demand.
Yeah, exactly right. So that it's, you know, if a group of people are coming together and then maybe one of those groups want to move out, making sure that there's other ways for other people to come into that as well. I think that's really important.
I've heard it said that from a debt perspective, the most important things that funders are looking for are the character, capacity, and capability, you know, of the project proponents, I suppose. So it sounds,
very
in your summary there, you know, like that, it's really sort of, if it boils down to it, those are the 3 C's that are sort of, you know, first and foremost what debt funders are looking to satisfy themselves on.
Absolutely, and comes back to relationships again, Tim, as well, about who you work with. You know, it's not just, you know, you on your project. There's so many different players that you have on your projects and other people's projects, and that just alignment is just so completely critical, that we're all here to achieve the same thing.
All right, so thanks for that. So last question then, what are the key barriers you see in funding alternative housing models?
Probably most people realise capital is such a big barrier, right? So we can provide a strip of capital. So we can provide debt. There's other forms of capital that need to come into it, and equity, you know, is a big piece of that. How does that work? You know, is there enough return in it? And I guess when we're trying to do alternate models, which are new, which, you know, people maybe not get their head around, maybe a lot of people don't know about what alternate models, and I think there's so many different structures as well you can have, right, in alternative housing, different financial, legal, and being able to create that capacity for a pilot sort of like program as well. And I think some of the things we just touched on around, you know, the character and intention, how you de-risk something to make an equity provider feel comfortable to come into it. I think, you know, that's really important. I mean, how do other players come in as well? So government, you know, rental yields for private market housing is like low and often difficult to stack up. You know, is there a role for government or landowners, whether that be councils, or I always, when I worked in the community housing sector, we always talked about all the different pieces that have to come together to make a project viable. And it's difficult, right? There's lots of different players, and you know, banks are part of that solution, but there's certainly other people who need to be part of that solution as well. I think there's some things that we can look at in tax settings as well, and GST, and you know, even so even down to things like Commonwealth Rent Assistance as well, about some of the rules around those sorts of things as well. So I think that's that, Tim. I think some of the other barriers are probably outside our control. Some of the macroeconomic area things are happening in our world at the moment: rising interest rates, inflation. We're going to have a global recession, and it makes capital providers more nervous. And I think it means that we need to really be thinking about how we're mitigating and managing risk, how we're
Yeah.
working with the right partners,
Yeah, that
how we're bringing people together.
Scrutiny
I think
becomes
it's
more
just-
important. Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So, yeah, I think there's like capital is always going to be, and I guess that's why we're here today, to talk about, you know, financing alternatives, and I think it's really just about that, you know, whole ecosystem sort of coming together, and finding people, I guess, to do the modelling, to do the thinking, and to find players willing to do that. And I'm really proud to say at Bank Australia we are prioritising that, you know, not just within my team, but you know, we're embedding impact and purpose in everything we do. We have an impact division as well, helping us sort of inform some of our thinking and giving us that capacity to do the thinking. I think sometimes as the bankers can forget, you know, you sort of get your guideposts, the goalposts, but you know, so one of the things that I think is really powerful is just having that team and that priority to be able to do that thinking and to assist the sector, and that's what that team I'm really proud to lead. So yeah, so I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, no, I think it does. And I suppose, I mean, maybe one of the key takeaways that anybody considering sort of progressing a alternative housing model is to have those conversations earlier in the piece. You know, like if it's about prosecuting an alternative structure, having those conversations and maybe approaching yourself or the bank to just have those conversations early and understand those tensions or conditions, you know, that Bank Australia would need to have met, you know, so that from a structuring perspective and a commercials perspective, you're understanding what the constraints, I suppose, of your debt funder are, so then you can fashion a solution that you know meets them. You know, I think because at the end of the day, while equity is super important, in most projects it's the debt funder that's lending you the lion's share of that capital stack to get the project done. Yeah, so that dance between the equity and debt has to be, you know, it has to be a good dance.
yeah. I think it's also about, you know, I see ourselves as more than just a lender as well. So it's about connecting people as well.
Yeah.
It's like, so I don't know, we do that sometimes, Tim, as well. You know, connect people, connect each other to others that we know, and that like peer-to-peer sort of learning. It's just in bringing people with similar ideas together to collaborate and think. I think that's really, really important as well.
Yeah, no, 100%. Well, I think that's the way the sector is going to grow, you know, at the end of the day. Yeah.
Find other people who are also trying to solve the same problems as you, and like, you know, work that together, and partnerships and that storytelling and that connecting is just, you know, really super important. And I know I value that with you sometimes, Tim, as well, like, you know, connecting each other to, oh, hey, you're doing this, or, you know, I think that's really powerful.
You should speak
to this person. Yeah.
Cool. All right, well, thanks, Emma.
Thank you so much. Apologies again, I couldn't be there on the live stream, but I hope the video has been useful, and certainly nice chatting to you, Tim, as always.
Cool.
Take care.
Thanks, Emma.
Thank you.
Okay,
Bye.
bye.
Great. Thank you, Tim. There's a question in the chat from JP, but maybe we'll go into your presentation first, and then you might be able to come back to that.
Sure. Okay. Well, I've got a few slides, so I might just share my screen.
Yep.
Just bear with me a sec.
Feel free to keep adding questions in the chat too. Then we can come to you after Tim's presentation.
Cool. So, yeah, look, I'll try. We went a bit over time with Emma's interview, so I'll try and keep this to 15 minutes max. So, yeah, I'm going to talk probably mostly about equity, and you know, I suppose the conversation with Emma was foremost about debt. And this picture is from our latest collective in Eltham, which is a 20 home co-housing project. And I kind of want to share some of the learnings I suppose we've had on this project, just to, I suppose, you know, highlight some of the challenges with alternative models like our building groups, which is a sort of a at-cost ownership model, but also inform, I suppose, how we're thinking about how to improve that model and how to sort of grow this this space. So, so in terms of finance options, really, I think what we're talking about is equity and debt. You know, what are the solutions for your project around both of those aspects of the capital stack? And for this presentation, in terms of just defining housing alternatives, I mean, I'm talking about the at-cost ownership model that we've developed over the last 10 years, the building groups, or, you know, Baugruppe. And then also we're starting to explore rental co-ops and how an at-cost rental model might work. I mean, both share, all the projects we've started to get involved with, they all share sort of co-housing principles, but obviously the financial models to sort of enable those communities are quite different. This is an infographic that a collaborator of ours, Andy Fergus, put together for Assemble Papers, and I thought it's probably helpful just to define what we're talking about here. So really what we're looking at is private land, whereby we're developing or enabling Baugruppe or building groups, some of which are co-housing projects and some of which are, I suppose, community light. So we've done a number of projects which are sort of intentional communities, and then other projects which have been not so, well, been community light, I suppose, in their approach. And then again, we're starting to look at cooperative rental as well. And in terms of, I suppose, the segment, really, I think what our focus is increasingly on is how do we make these sorts of models more accessible to moderate and middle income households. So in terms of housing alternatives, from my perspective over the last couple of years, I think the biggest factors that can help unlock more housing alternatives is pre-acquisition investment strategy and impact funding. And I'll explain why over the next few slides. And the key really is around controlling the equity, because if you can control the equity, you can control the outcome, to put it very simply. And that's the key challenge then for housing alternatives, is how to attract equity to your project to that shares the vision of what you're trying to do, to enable your project. So just quickly a little bit on us. So we're developers and advisors, and we like to focus our time and money on projects with purpose and impact. There's three streams to what we're doing. One is advisory, another one is the building groups, and third one is impact funding. So from an advisory perspective, we've sort of brought together a cooperative network of property professionals, and we're working collaboratively on a range of residential and commercial projects and joint ventures, from the ideation stage right through to the delivery stage. For building groups, we've been developing and managing a number of building groups over the last 12 years. And we've sort of evolved over time this deliberative home ownership model that brings people together to co-develop the homes and communities they want at cost. And impact funding is something that we've just started to focus on, I suppose, over the last 12 to 18 months. And that's really about creating an impact equity investment platform to enable more community-led and collaborative housing projects. So from an advisory perspective, we've been working with a range of different clients. So state government like DELP and the OVGA on their Future Homes competition, which they just released in their first phase a couple of weeks ago. Villa Maria Catholic Homes, who are retirement living, aged and in-home care and affordable housing provider. Homes Victoria on some of the big housing build projects. We've also been involved with the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation in enabling a joint venture between a community housing provider and a church in Preston. And then we've also been advising Wink Co-housing, who are a older women's co-housing group looking to create a community in Dalesford. And then also Cooperation Housing WA, who are looking at a 26 dwelling co-housing rental co-op for over 55s in WA. So I suppose that's given us a really good breadth of experience across different impactful projects. But just focusing on the building groups, I suppose the key difference with building groups, the building group model, is that we are effectively enabling future resident groups to come together and co-develop. You know, the step one here is really about a core group of people coming together and under a shared vision around what they want to try and create from a built form perspective, but then also from a community perspective. And having a significant part of that community come together before we go and purchase land that's going to, you know, enable their vision. So I suppose that's the key difference between a building group approach and I suppose a speculative approach, where you know, a speculative developer buying the land and then finding people for their idea. So the group in step two works together to refine their specific needs, and then they're in control of the design and the build of their own project, obviously with us guiding that process. And then on completion, everybody receives a home that's customised to their needs at cost. And we do aim for around 15% than market. So the model really takes fractional property ownership over a single title, and then through the development process enables direct home ownership at cost. We've created 10 collectives since 2010, building 80 homes, or in the process of having completed and building 80 homes. And in terms of the scale, you know, that's equated to just under about $1 million worth of projects at a cost of 84 million. And we've delivered and are forecasting to deliver around 12 million in savings to market, because of all the members obviously get their homes at cost. So we're dealing on the cost economy, not on the value economy. And to get there, we've raised 32 million of co-developer equity from members and around 52 million in debt funding from CBA, Bank of Melbourne, Bank of Queensland and Bank Australia, as just heard from Emma. So some of the projects, first project in Northcote, second project in Northcote, third project in Thornbury, fourth project in St Kilda. This is the Victoria Street Collective, which is a 10 apartment intentional community in West Brunswick, which we've just started construction on. And this is the site for the Eltham Collective, or Bowen Street co-housing in Eltham. And our plans there are to retain the existing buildings on site and build 17 new homes and retrofit the existing buildings, one to be a common house and the other one to be some residents in a cluster house master plan typology. So these are a few renders. We've just submitted our town planning application, and this is sort of the outdoor dining space sort of to the south of the common house. And we've got a couple of ponds or stormwater lakes, for whatever the term, at the bottom of the site. So looking to regenerate them and make them a really great communal asset. So just returning to the theme around controlling the equity to control the outcome. This slide is really about explaining, well, why do we think equity is the critical enabler? So from a funding perspective, from the cost side, this is a typical snapshot of what your development finance capital stack is going to be. So you need to fund 100% of your costs. Typically, the debt funders will be providing around 65% of that cost. GST will make up circa 5%, and the developer will have to put in 30% equity capital. So for all of the collectives that we've created, the 10 over the last 12 years, all of the members have put in this 30% equity. And that's enabled us to create the projects that we have, and they've sort of ranged from sort of 6 dwellings up to 20 dwellings. And as I said earlier, you know, we've managed to source around $52 million in debt funding for these projects, and around 32 million in co-developer equity. But actually, when you look at this model, it's actually quite a simple capital solution. You know, we take our senior debt from a bank, and then the members of each collective carry the balance. So if we want to see more co-housing projects and more communities of larger scale, and I think the key reason from our perspective why we want to explore this is because if we can do larger projects, we can push the total cost of dwellings down, but then we can also make the accessibility of these projects from an equity perspective more accessible. So if we're going to get there, we actually require a more complex capital solution than the one that we've been running for the last 12 years. And we think that the key there is to get early stage sophisticated investor and institutional investment in these projects, supporting these projects, which is not something that we've managed to do yet, but it's something that we're working on. So if we can do that, we end up having a bit of a different capital stack. We end up introducing another layer into that capital stack. So we've got building groups 2 there, you know, it could be that we reduce the amount of equity that collective members need to contribute to, say, 15%, and we have an impact investor who's aligned to what we're trying to achieve to contribute a 15% to make up that equity capital stack. Similarly, for rental co-ops, it may be that the members have even less equity to put into the project. And so therefore the reliance then on an impact investor becomes higher to meet that threshold for the equity capital. So just going back to Eltham, you know, this is part of the reason why we're trying to explore, well, how do we enable more intentional communities like Eltham and make these projects more impactful than they have the potential to be now. You know, this photo is the original starting members, I suppose, of Bowen Street Co-housing, and they played a critical role in this project coming to life, because they were prepared to put in the equity in the early stages to do the investment analysis, do the DD, fund that acquisition, and effectively de-risk the project for the future members to come. And you know, that investment from this group was not a massive investment, but it was still significant. You know, it was around about $40,000 to fund sort of the investment strategy phase, and then also the DD leading up to acquisition. And this group funded that by creating membership fees of a bit under $2,000, so that you know, there was a pot of money there to pay for those for that due diligence work. And then to actually secure the site was a $10,000 initial deposit, and actually property collectives contributed that because of the financial situation of the group, and we wanted to co-contribute, I suppose, to the project happening. So you know, this $50,000 investment collectively basically enabled a project which we're forecasting is going to cost around $17.5 million. And this is the moment when the group all voted to proceed with the purchase of the site. And, you know, this was a very brave moment for this group, because we had actually courted a community housing provider who was thinking of investing, but their board failed to approve the investment. So this group of people were faced with the decision around whether to go it alone. And as you can see, they all opted to go it alone. So, you know, hats off. So I'm just conscious of time, I'll whip through these slides. So I suppose what we're saying is that we're thinking that the key to make these projects more affordable, inclusive, impactful is to do slightly larger projects, but start looking at mixed tenure. So the pie chart on the left is a snapshot of Eltham project. We have 20 dwellings. We've been able to enable one shared equity position because some of the members in that group have surplus equity, and they've almost sponsored one member to come in and have a shared equity position. But I think to grow this space, you know, we need to have a more robust solution. So the pie chart on the right is sort of showing, well, what would a mix look like if we had 30 homes with a shared equity position and a sort of a full equity position in the blue. And then we're starting a process of engaging with different CHPs and member-based organisations around their appetite to participate in these projects with a view to holding some of these homes for affordable rental. So from an impact funding perspective, we do think that really the key to attracting more equity into this space is that pre-acquisition advisory and investment management, but also the actual impact funding, you know, finding investors who are comfortable to provide a mandate to support more community-led projects. And at the moment, we're working with Social Enterprise Finance Australia and the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation on trying to unlock this. So again, why do we think early stage equity is the critical enabler? Well, this early stage equity is effectively the bridge between time and risk, and it de-risks the projects for debt to come in further down the line. It has a disproportionate impact in the capital stack. So the equity that funds this pre-acquisition investment strategy and land purchase deposit, it is the most impactful capital that will be invested in the whole project. And this slide sort of shows you graphically why. So what this slide is showing is actually the Eltham project over time, and it is the funding stack but represented over time. So What you have in the grey is our equity, and what you have in the yellow is the loan for the land, and in the blue is the construction loan. And you see the project started day one in September 21, and we're forecasting it to end in September 25. The whole project will require around $5 million in equity, and these are ex-GST numbers. But the important thing to point out is that even though day zero for Eltham was September 21, we actually worked with that group since late 2020 in helping them define their strategic vision and work on their investment strategy. And you'll see this pointy edge of the equity stack is really relates to the fund that I was talking about before, where that really early stage equity has enabled the project. So this was that around $40,000 investment strategy in the DD, but also the $10,000 deposit to secure the land. And one thing that I think it's important to sort of relay to people is then, as you look at this development process over time, it's important to understand how the market views risk return pricing. So on day zero, you have quite high risk. And so therefore, you know, capital markets are wanting high returns. And then on completion in September 25, you have effectively zero risk. You've finished the project. So I think it's good for people to have in mind what the market is really asking for that capital at different stages. So typically for early stage equity investment, investors are looking at 15 to 20% returns on their cash invested. For land purchase finance, the debt, it's around about 6% at the moment. Further down the line, some developers will take on mezzanine finance, and that typically is around 15%. You know, it can vary quite a bit depending on the project, but you know, it's typically around that 15% mark. And construction debt at the moment is sort of sitting around 7 to 8%. Home loans on completion, you know, obviously they're varying as well, but they're about 5 to 6%. And government bonds at 4 to 5% are really important to keep everybody to keep their eye on what the government bond rate is out 5 to 10 years, because that is effectively that price of zero risk. You know, because if the government bond is yielding 4 to 5% in 10 years, there's no risk that an investor is ever going to lose their money on that. So that is almost your floor, right, for risk. Now for Eltham, we actually got an offer for impact investment through an equity loan structure at 20%, when the group still needed to fill up half the project. But this group rejected it and decided to create an intra joint venture loan at 10%, because we were lucky enough that some of those members had extra equity and they were happy to invest that into the project.
Tim, we've got Linda's joined the channel now.
Yep.
So we might go over to her, and then we can, because there's a few questions in the chat as well. So if you just want to finish up, and then we'll come back.
I know I've gone over. Sorry, this is literally the second last slide, I think. So, so yeah, look. In summary, I think one of the challenges for this space is that, you know, if this space is going to grow, I think we need sophisticated investment analysis to attract sophisticated investment. And I think it becomes a virtuous sort of cycle. You know, if we have more pre-acquisition investment strategies, we'll have more institutional equity into projects, we'll have more alternative housing outcomes. And so, yeah, we think that is the key to seeing this sector grow. Cool.
Great. Thanks so much, Tim. Linda, welcome. Thank you so much for being able to join us today. I know you were rushing from another commitment, so thanks for coming along. Do you have slides to?
Yeah, I've got a website and I've got a couple of slides, so I'll just share my screen if that's all right.
Yeah, just giving you access, so just check if that's going to work.
Share screen. Yep. Is that working?
Perfect. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So, yeah, thanks for having me. I've just come from the AGM of another housing organisation, so that's why I've just arrived. So my name's Linda Seaborn, and I live here at the Co-Housing Cooperative, which you can see on your screen. There's some images there of our place. We're in Hobart, in the foothills of the mountain, Kunani, and we were built in 2000. So I'll just go down these photos so you can see our houses are quite small. They're all, you can see in the, can you see, is it big enough for you to see the pictures properly?
Yeah, they look good.
Yeah. So we've got solid timber kitchens. They're all built with no plywood and no outgassing timbers. We've got some shared gardens down the back. It snows in winter. We have a lovely view of the mountain behind the houses, and you can sort of see the construction of the houses here. And so we were funded under the old community housing program that wrapped up in about the 1990s, and that had funds that were tied to the development of housing cooperatives, rental housing cooperatives. And so that's where your era of housing cooperatives that you see around Australia come from. And funding's been, well, the funding's changed since then. So the housing cooperatives around Australia had to form companies to comply with government funding legislation. And so that's where you get your Common Equity New South Wales and Common Equity Limited in Victoria, and there's another Common Equity in South Australia and again in Western Australia. And so they hold the assets for the member housing cooperatives who democratically control those companies. But in Tasmania, we were a bit small for that. We didn't go down that pathway. So our 6 housing cooperatives still maintain independence. And I'll stop sharing for now, just so I can talk without being distracted by that. And so I've kind of got 2 hats on here. One is I'm a member of the housing cooperative sector. I live in a housing cooperative. And the other is that I've started working for the Business Council of Cooperatives and Mutuals on a broad range of cooperative policy. But obviously I bring knowledge of the housing cooperative sector, and so I'm specialising in that area. My daughter lives in New York, which has a very large housing cooperative sector. So when I go over to stay with her, I research that. And I also work with Sidsel Grimstead, who specialises in researching the housing cooperative sector in Northern Europe. So between us, we have got a pretty broad overview of the different models. And in Australia, what's missing is the shared equity or limited equity cooperatively owned housing, which I know Elena shares my interest in. And I'm hoping that there's quite a few people here today that do, and I think Tim's got some curiosity about it. And so by that I mean, when we have cooperatives, we can have rental cooperatives, which is what most of the housing cooperatives in Australia are. So that's where the property is owned by somebody, often the state government who lease them to the cooperatives, sometimes the Common Equity Limited company, and the housing cooperative has some form of control of the houses, but not ownership of them, and runs the management of them as a housing cooperative to varying degrees. You know, often they don't have the major maintenance responsibility. Usually they have the rent collection responsibility, but you know, there's different mixes of how you can do that. At the other extreme is cooperatives that enable private home ownership. And they're all, these are really good models because getting into the housing market is important. However, if you think that private ownership of houses and houses as a vehicle for investment and the speculative nature of investment in housing is what's driving the crisis that we're in, like I do, then you might be looking for another way. And so this is where the housing cooperatives in New York are really interesting, because these are largely built by the union movement between the 1930s and the 1970s, and designed for working people who don't earn enough money to buy to live in. And so what they do is they have enough money to contribute some of the equity of the house, but not the full equity of the house. So the government subsidies would go to, there'd be grant money that would pay for the equity that the householder couldn't put in. And then the householder would buy a share in the cooperative, right? They're not buying a strata title, they're not buying a house, they're buying a share in the cooperative. And that share entitles them to, you know, secure residency in the unit of housing that that's attached to, and that's usually in an apartment block. And this is, and it's a limited equity model. So there's an agreed value of that share, and there's an agreement around what kind of gain that share gets. So the majority of them, and the ones that I'm interested in, are the ones that don't get the capital gain. So it's not tied to the increase or decrease in the value of the property. It has an agreement. It's usually something like CPI, or, you know, a fair interest return rate, as if you had invested that money somewhere else. So then when the person leaves, they sell their share usually back to the cooperative, who then sells it again to somebody in the market. And what that does is it makes the housing permanently affordable, because the speculative nature of the investment is gone. It's out of the equation. And that's usually to do with the land. So sometimes they will have a land trust sitting underneath it, or the government will own the land. And that's the way that it's often done in Europe. In Europe, there are some more ones where there's more of a market value of the cooperative, so it depends on which country, but sometimes, and some of the New York ones do this too, where they bring in the market value of the cooperative. People say, well, why shouldn't I have the right to have the full value of what this unit of housing is worth? And then it stops being affordable, but it, you know, it's still a form of ownership. But the ones I'm really interested in are the limited equity ones. Now, we don't really have them in Australia, but that's kind of my work at the BCCM, is to try to develop that model in Australia, as well as support the other forms of housing cooperatives. And so there's a couple of ways that I'm doing this. One is looking at remodelling the housing cooperative where I live, because we hold title, well, we hold title to our houses, and we've got the ability to experiment with requiring capital investment from members as they, in our case, sometimes people have inherited money as their parents pass away, and sometimes people have moved into better paid jobs, because we all originally came in eligible for social housing. And as our circumstances change, some of us can actually contribute some capital to the cooperative. So we're looking at doing a bit of a restructure there to try to create a model that could be duplicated other places. And I'll just share my screen again. The other way that I'm working around this model is in my work with the BCCM, where we develop policy platforms for the cooperative sector. That picture there is just one that we've done for the whole of the New South Wales, but we're working on a policy platform around cooperative housing, because obviously Australia's got an affordability crisis, and that what we're positioning it around needing a more diversity in the models of housing that is available, and that the key thing about housing cooperatives is having the, you know, democratic control by the residences. But we're calling it the third pillar, having that model, that the shared equity model. And yeah, we're looking to models from around the world that deliver that security of tenure. So, I mean, really what the housing cooperative model does is we're looking for that security. We're looking for the benefits of home ownership. where you've got the security of tenure, you've got that kind of autonomy and agency to control your own housing, but we're looking at ways of making it affordable. And the policy position that we're developing is lobbying government to recognise that there is a third way of doing this, and looking at them to change they have funding that's out there around shared equity and home ownership, and we're asking them to tweak those funding programs to start to fund the kind of shared equity model that we're talking about. And to support the sector to develop more materials to educate people around it. And we're looking at working with NIFIC, well, that's changing to Housing Australia, I think, but the National Housing Financial Investment Corporation, I think they are, and about making the different funding streams that they're making available for housing suitable for going into the shared equity housing, and that's us. And just started doing some work with Tim, who was talking before, and I am loving learning all of the nuts and bolts about how housing finance is constructed, because that's the kind of thing that we're having to start talking with NIFIC and the government about. That's me.
Excuse me, Tim. Eleanor has actually dropped out. She's just called me. She's got connectivity problems. Hang on.
That's a disaster.
Yes, sorry about that. Yeah, I'm just talking to Eleanor now. Tim, would you like to have a relevant and important chat with Linda about her presentation while I work out if Eleanor's joining us? Otherwise, I'm very happy to help facilitate questions.
Someone's just asked for this page again too, so I will just pop that back up for a minute. Yeah.
So Linda, maybe from where you've got to today with the work that you're doing, I mean, what are you seeing as the key challenges that you know you're going to have to work on to overcome over the next, I suppose, into the future?
I think the key challenge for us is getting somebody willing to invest in holding the other part of the equity or doing a grant, because in Australia we're so used to home ownership is the gold standard, and we understand renting, but we don't understand the concept of owning a share in a business that provides housing. Yeah. Yeah, and I'm learning a lot from you about the language that we have to use there, and how the numbers stack up to make things like that work. And I'm on a steep learning curve at the moment, but I've enjoyed learning about your model. And as I said to you the other day, I can see how at the point with your model where it moves to strata titling, that's where I'd like to kind of put a little a new step in there. Instead of strata titling, using the developer model that you've got, but then to bring it into a cooperative ownership instead.
Yeah, and look, I think the challenge with that is going to be, just what that tension is between equity and debt, because you're going to have different gearing ratios that different debt providers are wanting to satisfy, at that point, for that sort of operational phase or investment phase. So, for me, I think that's where that focus is going to have to be. And I think, working with you on coloring as well, it's a good opportunity for us to start exploring that, and just get a sense of where different debt funders, where they draw the line, and then also well, how do we? I'm sure there will be an equity gap. How does that equity gap get solved for? Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm hoping that our lobbying work is going to mean that the government is going to invest in it.
Yep.
Through grants, because that's how it's worked that's how it works in other countries. So, and there were experiments in the New York housing cooperatives where they went for a much greater proportion of private finance without government support at all, and it was unsustainable. When you're addressing a market failure, there's extra resource that has to come from somewhere. So we're not talking about people who can afford to buy their own housing. So there is a gap there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah.
So Tim, without Eleanor here, what I can do is come back through the chat and have
Yep.
a look at some questions. And
Sure.
please forgive me if I do refer to a question that you may have already covered. So JP has asked, and let me know if you've already talked about this. If we were to map all the moving parts to bring an alternative housing project together, what would be on the map? Does one already exist so that project developers can ensure they've covered all the bases?
Look, I think I'm not aware of a map. I suppose the map would be doing a property development course to sort of get an understanding of all the different elements that come to play. Yeah, look, it's a really strange job being a developer. You know, like you end up having to be a bit of a generalist and know, you know, a fair amount about everything. But ultimately, I think when it comes to, I think what I see is the biggest challenge for sort of emerging groups is that they come at things from a property strategy first perspective. So it's about a built form outcome in a certain location, and they do get, I think, quite emotionally attached to that, and that's fine on one level. But I mean, the other level is understanding, well, what are the commercial structures and what are the financial levers to, you know, create that built form outcome. And that's quite multidimensional. You know, like there's a lot of different levers around how you transact on the land, and then how you and what your funding strategy is to obtain debt and then pay debt back, and equity as well. You know, so yeah, look, it's a hard one to provide a step-by-step sort of guide to. Yeah, I'm not sure how else to answer that.
I was recently in a forum for an international forum around housing cooperatives, and in England there's a group who've developed this tool called Wayfinders that I think we should do one in Australia. So it's for community groups of people that want to come together to undertake a community-driven housing project. And it they've actually set it up as a set of cards, and you have to lay all the cards out and you have to make decisions. And so particular decisions that you make cut off some options and drive other options, and you have to work your way through, and it links all the different steps together until you've got a plan that has all the pieces in it. And so it reflects it that it's not a linear process, because every choice you make generates another set of choices.
Yes. Yeah, it's a dynamic process, you know. And that's where, I mean, like Emma was talking about, you know, how her team at Bank Australia, you know, she's been careful to structure her resources so that, you know, her team have capacity to look at innovative things early on. You know, the thing that a map can't necessarily capture is just, you know, the dynamic nature of capital markets at a certain point in time. Like, they change all the time. You know, like if we're having this conversation last year, we had, you know, cash rate at, you know, 0.5% or something, you know, like it's not that now. So the world's changed. Yeah. So it is quite a dynamic process. But I think the, you know, the key thing to set you off on different paths is this fundamental question around, okay, well, is what we want to create, is it ownership or is it rental? And I think what I was trying to show in my presentation is, I think if you start with the ownership layer, you can actually introduce rental as well through that. It does require partnerships, obviously, but that's almost your threshold question. You know, is it in a binary level? Are you wanting ownership or strata at the back end, or is it more for rental? I think what we've managed to do with the ownership model is create something that's pretty robust. I think, as Linda was saying, you know, the model that's lagging is this rental, sort of at-cost rental model, because it's been so reliant on subsidy and the resource co-ops over time. So I think you know, that one for me is a bit more challenging because we don't really have the answers yet.
Okay, thank you. Might move on. Simon's asked a question, a related question. He says, what role, if any, can finance providers play in influencing the planning laws and codes that shape what's possible? Laws and codes are actually critical to enabling innovation.
Yeah, so what can financiers do? I think I'm just looking for that.
Yeah, it's a fair way back. What can
finance providers play around? Well, look, I mean, finance providers really aren't necessarily in the business of influencing planning outcomes. I mean, you know, we saw in the budget that the federal Labor government was coming out with this accord, you know, which was supposed to be cross-disciplinary across, you know, funders, super funds, builders, and I'm assuming state governments, because state governments are ultimately control land, land zoning and controlling land. But I honestly see probably a very limited role for finance providers. I mean, interestingly enough, I think there's quite a few councils looking at how they can provide planning control bonuses for developers that are looking to do things differently. We've been engaged by Maroondah City Council to sort of look at running some feasibility studies on some typologies that they would allow for consolidated sites sort of in the middle ring suburbs, and they're looking to sort of understand whether or not those planning concessions they're prepared to give would actually encourage, you know, that sort of development. So I think, you know, the local councils are starting to look at this. But yeah, I think the ability of financiers to influence planning outcomes is pretty limited practically.
Okay, Linda, did you have any comments on that one?
Sorry, I'm distracted looking for the Wayfinder link.
That's okay. There are a couple of questions about that. That's all right. We'll move on. Tim, Jasmine has asked, are your mixed tenure projects still strata titled or co-op ownership?
Yeah, well, look, the first thing to say is we haven't yet enabled one. We're wanting to, but I think at a baseline level, it would still be strata titled, but the institutional partner that would join those projects sort of to hold multiple homes for affordable rental, you know, they would still hold multiple titles under our model. Whether or not you could create a co-op to sit beside the owners corp, you know, that's something we were exploring with Common Equity Housing Limited in Victoria. They were interested in sort of potentially getting involved on our projects and looking at how they could evolve their co-op structure to kind of, you know, be more, yeah, come into place in line with the owners corp during the operational phase, but have obviously individual titled ownership, but that hasn't really progressed
Did you have any comments, Linda?
Well, I think this is the area that hasn't really been broken yet. That that idea of cooperative ownership, and where it's not rental and it's not ownership. It's a different model that gives the benefits of ownership, and it looks and feels a bit like rental, but there's no landlord. So it's a bit sometimes a bit hard to imagine, really, but it exists many places in the world, and it's pretty close to the place where I live, so it is possible.
Thank you. Michelle has said, we learned in a webinar yesterday the amount of money put into property investment tax deductions. Surely there has to be room to move those deductions to towards grants that fund these models.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think those questions are bigger questions than what our pay grade is at the moment. But you know, I mean, obviously Labor took some pretty big changes to the 2016 election, was it? The one that they lost to Morrison. I think that result has sort of put paid to any meaningful tax reform. Look, I don't disagree, but I just sort of think, you know, to prosecute projects in this environment, you kind of need to be looking at what the most likely tax environment is going to be for the next, you know, 5 years at least. So I think sort of things like the tax reform and all those sorts of things, you know, I think the lobbying will continue, but whether or not anything fundamentally changes, I'd be surprised personally.
But alongside that, like, even though they have shied away from the tax reform, which is a bit of a pity, they are still investing. So the two things aren't necessarily linked, even if they don't reform the tax stuff. They are investing, and what used to be NIFIC, or still is NIFIC at the moment, is converting to Housing Australia, and I've got some notes here. So they're setting up the new National Housing Supply and Affordability Council, which will be helping them develop policy, and you know that policy is probably going to talk about tax reform amongst other things. And that's where we're trying to have an intervention there as well too, to encourage them to look at funding you know, more sort of halfway cooperative models, because we think that they're missing out by not allowing people to have equity where they can afford to, rather than the full cost of the house, but what they can afford to. That will help to make the housing dollars that they do have go further. So, and they're quite open to those conversations. I mean, it was the Labor Party that drove the birth of the housing cooperative movement back in the 70s and 80s. So it is there in their DNA to sort of devolve power and control to the people who live in the houses. So we're hopeful through this new council that they're forming to develop policy that we'll be able to make some ground there. And they have, you know, announced quite a few funding schemes. So they've got the Help to Buy scheme and the their shared equity schemes, and you know, we're just talking with them about making sure that they divert some of that, or make it available to cooperatives. Don't just go for one model of housing, which is just straight up home ownership. But they are increasing their investment in housing, so that's good.
Great, thanks, Linda. There's actually just a couple of comments. Michelle has cheerfully asked, where can we sign up for a Property Collectives property development course?
Yeah,
I was thinking I'd love to have something like that on offer through NENA. Maybe we should seriously look at that. Michelle has commented, when people pay back double the house price in loans to a bank, again, if we take out that interest and bank profits, there are more possibilities. Don't know if you want to comment on that, other than to say, yes, there would be more possibilities.
Were there any other questions? We've got 9 more minutes. I just wonder if there's any questions people wanted to ask direct.
The only other thing is that Linda Hahn has said that Zola Rose in New Zealand is looking into developing the Wayfinder process for New Zealand. She's shared an email address there.
I copied that, thank you.
And then Simon has asked, do you have any thoughts on the future of financing for tiny houses?
No, I don't actually. I mean, no, I haven't really had my head in that space. I just know that, at least from a multi-res perspective, you know, the banks are really wanting to see sort of like a minimum 50 square meters for apartments. I know Bank Australia did support a few smaller dwellings types in Nightingale Village, but yes, I don't really, I'm not really familiar with the financing market for tiny homes, unfortunately.
Okay. Linda, are you aware of anything?
Not in Australia, but there is a really good model. I think it's in Oregon where people are supported, like can take out mortgages to buy a tiny house, which might be worth, I don't know, $50,000 or $70,000. And the model is that it gives them a first step into the housing ladder. And I think that would, you know, I think it's not the role of co-ops particularly, but I think that's a great thing to you know, argue for in Australia as a way to support people into home ownership.
Yeah, it's interesting. Okay, well, we don't have any other questions now. We've just had a number of people saying thank you, really enjoyed this session. And I do have a text message from Eleanor. She says to apologise profusely. Her entire suburb has had a power outage, which has cut out the internet for her at least. So yes, that's a shame. So we might just start to wrap up, and I'm speaking slowly in case anyone's got any last minute burning questions. Michelle Wang says, thanks, Linda and Tim, amazing presentation. And there's lots of other thank yous coming in. So on that note, we might start to wrap up and say a huge thank you to Tim and Linda and to Emma for the pre-record. And thanks for your time arranging that to happen, Tim. We're very grateful for your time. And here at the New Economy Network Australia, there's a whole bunch of further activities and issues we'll be exploring into the coming year. So we do hope to stay in touch with you all, and financing the good stuff for our housing crisis is obviously critically important. So on that note, no other questions coming through, so we shall release you all back into the wild. Thank you so much. Do think about joining the session tonight, 6 p.m. Brisbane time, 7 p.m. Southern time, and we've got 4 more activities this week. Tomorrow's all about sustainable housing and building alternatives and lots of cool things. So thank you, everybody, and hopefully we'll see you on the next Zoom get-together.
Thanks, Michelle. Thanks for organising it.
Very
Thank
welcome.
you.
Thanks for joining us.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.